Late September sunlight streamed through the tall windows of Dr. Alan Kessler's office, painting the sterile white walls a warm, golden hue that was almost mocking in its cheerfulness. Tim Miller sat on the edge of the exam table, his crisply pressed navy suit jacket folded neatly on the chair next to him, his crisp white shirt slightly wrinkled from the morning's rush. At 48, Tim was the picture of collected success, a corporate lawyer at the top of his game, with a corner office in a glittering glass tower in downtown Washington, a six-figure salary, and a reputation for closing deals that others couldn't. His dark hair, slightly gray at the temples, gave him an air of authority, and his keen green eyes missed nothing except, perhaps, the cracks that were quietly forming beneath the surface of his carefully constructed life. The suburbs of Arlington, Virginia, where Tim and his family had lived for the past 2 decades, were a world of manicured lawns, colonial homes, and the kind of quiet ambition that hummed beneath the surface of every cul-de-sac. Here, everything seemed to work just right. School buses arrived on time, dogs didn't bark without reason, and neighbors nodded to each other as they mowed their lawns or walked their Labradors. Tim and his wife, Melissa, had built their life here, as carefully and systematically as the stones in a garden path. They were raising 3 children: Ellie, 22, a Georgetown graduate who had just begun working in public policy with the passion and conviction that she could change the world. Nate, 19, a sophomore at the University of Virginia who dreamed of a law career and spent his summers in a legal clinic. And Sophie, 16, a junior at Yorktown High School who was already filling her planning board with colleges, deadlines, and colorful sticky notes. Their house on North Stewart Street was a spacious 5-bedroom home with a conservatory and ivy climbing up the brick facade, making the neighbors slightly envious. At Christmas, the facade was decorated with strings of white lights, and at Halloween, with carefully selected pumpkins and lanterns hand-carved by Sophie. The lawn was textbook, neatly trimmed and a rich green, and in the garage were 2 cars, Melissa's SUV and Tim's electric car, a testament to their moderate but progressive outlook on the future. To the outside world, the Millers were the embodiment of the American dream: successful, attractive, stable. The house, the career, the children, the achievements all were going according to plan. But stability, as Tim soon learns, was a fragile illusion, a thin film stretched over hidden cracks. Everything that seemed immutable would slowly but surely begin to shift. And when the first signs of change began to show, he would realize that even the most tranquil suburbs could harbor storms. Dr. Kessler, a slight man in his 50s with a shock of gray hair and wire-rimmed glasses, walked into the office with a clipboard in his hand. His manner was professional but warm, with the kind of concern that puts patients at ease. Tim had seen him only once before, when he had changed doctors after his old one retired. It was supposed to be a routine annual checkup: blood tests, cholesterol levels, the usual battery of tests to make sure Tim could handle the frantic pace of his life. He felt fine, maybe a little more tired than usual, but he chalked it up to long hours at the bank and the stress of the recent merger deal. "Mr. Miller," Kessler began, settling into the chair across from Tim. His voice was even, but the slight hesitation made Tim's stomach instinctively clench. "Your labs and scans came back, and overall, everything looks good. Your blood pressure is a little elevated, but nothing alarming. We can discuss lifestyle changes if you're up for it." Tim nodded, his fingers tapping lightly on the edge of the table. "Of course, doctor. Spill it. More kale, less bourbon." Kessler chuckled, but it was hollow, and his eyes didn't quite meet Tim's. He turned a page on his tablet, his brow furrowing slightly. "There is one thing we need to discuss, though. It's unusual, and I want to be thorough in explaining it." Tim's fingers stopped tapping. He leaned forward slightly, his lawyerly instincts kicking in, reading the situation, picking up on the change in tone. "What exactly?" Kessler adjusted his glasses, his gaze finally meeting Tim's. "The blood tests included a genetic panel, standard for someone your age with your family history. It's routine, but it revealed something unexpected. According to the results, you have a condition called congenital bilateral absence of the vas deferens. Simply put, It's a genetic disorder that causes male infertility. The words hung in the air like a sudden fog, thick and disorienting. Tim blinked, his mind trying to process the information. Infertility, he repeated, his voice low, as if testing the word to see if it would make sense when spoken aloud. What do you mean, exactly? Kessler's expression softened, but his eyes were serious. It means that because of this condition, you are born without the channels that normally transport reproductive cells. It is a congenital problem present from birth. Men with this condition are unable to conceive naturally. Tim's breath caught in his throat, a sharp, involuntary spasm. He felt the room tilt slightly, the edges of his vision blurring, as if the world had been thrown off its axis. This is impossible, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I have 3 children. Ellie, Nate, Sophie. You must have mixed up the results. Kessler shook his head, his lips pressed into a thin line. I know this is shocking, Mr. Miller. I double-checked the results myself, and we ran the panel twice to be sure. The genetic markers are clear. This condition would make it biologically impossible for you to conceive children. Tim's hands gripped the edge of the exam table, his knuckles white. His mind was racing, a stream of thoughts colliding with one another. Ellie's wide, curious eyes as a toddler, her first tentative steps across the living room. Nate's infectious laugh, the way he'd cling to Tim's leg during a thunderstorm. Sophie's wit, her uncanny ability to mirror Tim's own dry humor. They were his. They were supposed to be his. He'd been there for every milestone, every night of fever, every school play and football game. The idea that they weren't his at least biologically was incomprehensible. You mean? Tim's voice broke, and he cleared his throat, forcing himself to maintain his composure. You mean my children aren't mine? Kessler raised his hand, his tone cautious but firm. I'm not saying anything about your family, Mr. Miller. I'm just telling you what the medical report shows. This condition doesn't change the fact that you raised your children, that you are their father in every meaningful sense. But biologically, you couldn't have conceived them. The words hit him like a physical blow, each one landing with precision, leaving Tim reeling. He stared at the floor, his mind a chaotic swirl of memories and questions. Melissa, his wife of 25 years, the woman he'd met in law school, the one who'd supported him through the late nights at the firm, through the stress of building their life together. Melissa, with her warm smile and sharp mind, her ability to charm clients and throw flawless dinner parties. Did she know? Had she been lying to him all these years? I don't understand, Tim finally said, his voice empty. How could I not know this? How could this not have come up before? It's not uncommon for this condition to go undiagnosed, Kessler explained. Many men only find out about it when they're trying to conceive and undergoing fertility tests. In your case, since you already had a family, there was no reason to suspect it. Routine screenings don't usually include genetic panels unless there's a specific cause. Tim's jaw clenched, his mind trying to piece together the timeline. Ellie had been born 2 years after he and Melissa had married. Nate had come 3 years later, Sophie 4 years after that. Had Melissa been unfaithful from the start? Or was there another explanation, some medical error, some miracle that contradicted the science Kessler so calmly expounded? The thought of confronting Melissa made his chest tighten, a sharp pain spreading like wildfire. I need to think about this, Tim said sharply, standing up and grabbing his jacket. His movements were mechanical, his mind already elsewhere. I need to process this. Of course, Kessler said, rising as well. I'm here if you have any questions or want to discuss next steps. I can recommend counseling services to you and your wife. No, Tim snapped, his voice sharper than he'd intended. Not yet. I need time. Kessler nodded, his expression full of practiced sympathy. Take as much time as you need, Mr. Miller. My office is open whenever you're ready. Tim was barely aware of himself as he walked toward his car, a black Audi parked in the parking lot of the medical center. The autumn air was crisp, with a faint scent of fallen leaves, but Tim didn't notice. his mind consumed by a swirl of questions and doubts that now threatened to destroy everything he knew to be true. Tim drove down Route 66, his fingers tight on the steering wheel as the black Audi slid through the traffic heading home from downtown Washington. The evening light was fading, turning the sky a deep indigo, and the streetlights along the road were beginning to flicker, as if to highlight the inexorable passage of time. Chaos was churning inside Tim, his thoughts swirling like leaves in the autumn wind, and each one came back to the same thing. Dr. Kessler's words, cold and uncompromising, like a death sentence. Men with this condition cannot conceive naturally. The phrase echoed in his head, each syllable like a hammer blow, shattering the foundation of his life. He turned on the radio, hoping to drown out the noise inside, but the voice of an NPR host ranting about tax reform was just irritating. Tim turned it off with a jerk, and the silence in the car became almost tangible, heavy as the air before a storm. He tried to focus on the road, the familiar route through Arlington, but his mind kept returning to Melissa, to his children, to their lives that now seemed built on shifting sand. 25 years of marriage, 3 children, countless dinners, vacations, school reunions, it all felt foreign to him now, as if he were looking at his life through a distorted glass. As Tim turned onto North Stewart Street, his house appeared before him, as grand and welcoming as ever. A brick facade covered in ivy, warm light pouring in from the living room windows. He parked the car in the garage, turned off the engine, and sat for a few seconds, staring at the gray concrete wall. His heart was beating unevenly, and a pressure was building in his chest, as if someone were squeezing his lungs. He couldn't go inside the house, not now, not with this knowledge burning inside him. But he couldn't sit in the car forever, either. Tim forced himself out, slammed the door, and headed for the front door. Inside, a familiar scent greeted him, a mix of lavender from Melissa's diffuser and something warm and edible, probably the dinner she was making. Melissa had always loved to cook, even after long days at her consulting firm. It was one of the things Tim appreciated about her, her ability to keep the warmth of home alive despite both of their crazy schedules. Now the thought made him bitter. "Tim, is that you?" Melissa's voice came from the kitchen, soft and slightly playful, like it always did when she heard him coming home. "Yes, it's me," he said, trying to keep his voice even. He hung his jacket on the coat rack in the hallway and headed for the kitchen, feeling like an actor performing a role in a play whose script he no longer understood. Melissa stood at the stove, stirring something in a pan, the aroma of creamy sauce filling the kitchen. Her blonde hair was pulled back into a messy bun, with wisps of it escaping to caress her neck. She was wearing one of her favorite cream-colored cashmere sweaters, which clung softly to her slender frame. The sweater fit snugly, emphasizing her curves, her high breasts, still firm as if the years had passed them by, and her thin waist, which made her silhouette graceful, almost youthful. At 46, she retained that unmistakable appeal that had once driven him crazy. The same clear blue eyes, the same curve of her lips that could erase all his arguments in an instant. But now, looking at her, he saw more than just beauty. He saw doubt. Questions that pressed inside. Did she know? How many times had she lied? Who was the father of their children? And how could you live with someone for 20 years and suddenly feel like you don't know them? "How was your day?" she asked, not looking up from her cooking, but her tone was warm, as if she really wanted to know. "You look tired." "It's been a long day," Tim replied, walking over to the fridge and getting a bottle of water to keep his hands occupied. He couldn't look her in the eye, not now. "And you?" "Oh, you know, the usual. The client in Baltimore was causing drama about the deadline again, but I figured it out." She laughed, and the sound, so familiar, cut Tim like a knife. He nodded, taking a sip of water, and tried to smile, but it came out tight. "Is Sophie home?" he asked, trying to steer the conversation toward safe territory. Of their 3 children, only Sophie, their youngest, still lived with them. Ellie had moved into her own apartment in Georgetown after graduating, and Nate spent most of the year in Charlottesville, returning only for holidays. "She's in her room, doing her homework," Melissa replied, tasting the sauce off a wooden spoon. By the way, she was wondering if we could go to New York for her birthday. She wants to see a musical on Broadway. Sounds good, Tim said, his voice robotic and emotionless. He set the bottle down on the table and headed for the stairs. I'll go get changed. Melissa glanced at him briefly, her eyebrows raising slightly, but she said nothing. Tim felt her eyes following him as he walked up the stairs, and the sensation burned like a laser down his spine. He knew she had noticed his distant manner, but he didn't care right now. He wasn't ready to talk, wasn't ready for her questions, or worse, her lies. In the bedroom, Tim closed the door and leaned against it, closing his eyes. His mind was a minefield, every thought a potential explosion. He remembered Melissa announcing her first pregnancy, her face beaming with happiness as she showed him the test with 2 lines. He remembered holding Ellie in the hospital, her tiny fingers squeezing his thumb. He remembered Nate being born in the middle of a snowstorm, and how he and Melissa had laughed while stuck in the hospital for 3 days. He remembered Sophie's first cry, so loud the nurse joked she'd be an opera singer. These memories were his, they were real. How could they be a lie? But Kessler's words wouldn't let go. Tim walked to his desk, opened his laptop, and began searching for information on congenital bilateral absence of the vas deferens. He read medical articles, forums, scientific publications, and every word confirmed the diagnosis. The condition made conception impossible. There were maybe no exceptions. If he had been infertile since birth, then Ellie, Nate, and Sophie could not be his biological children. The thought was like poison, slowly spreading through his veins, poisoning everything he knew about his family. Tim closed his laptop and stared into space. His gaze fell on a family photo on the table, the 4 of them on the beach at Nag's Head a few years ago. Melissa was hugging Sophie, Ellie and Nate were building a sand castle, and Tim was standing behind him, laughing, his hand on Melissa's shoulder. He'd looked at this photo 100 times, but now it felt foreign to him, like he was looking at someone else's family. Who was the father of his children? Was it one person, or he couldn't even finish the thought? The image of Melissa with someone else, year after year, lay across his mind like a shadow, and he felt his stomach clench. He knew he couldn't live with the question without an answer. He needed proof, something tangible to either confirm his worst fears or disprove them. A DNA test. It was the only way to find out. Tim opened his laptop again and began searching for companies offering at-home DNA tests. He found several options, chose one that promised privacy and quick results, and placed an order for 3 testing kits, 1 for himself and 2 for the children who were still available to him. Sophie, who lived at home, and Nate, who was coming over for the weekend. Tim knew that collecting samples would be difficult. He couldn't just ask Sophie or Nate to spit into a vial without raising suspicion. Ellie, living on her own, was even more difficult. He'd have to come up with an excuse to meet her and perhaps collect a sample without her noticing. The thought of having to spy on his own children filled him with self-loathing, but the alternative, living in ignorance, was even worse. He began to remember little things that had seemed insignificant before, but now took on a sinister tone. Melissa worked late at work when Ellie was little. Her frequent trips to conferences early in their marriage, returning tired but with a strange glint in her eye. A man named David, a colleague at her firm who had always seemed too friendly at company parties until he quit and moved to another state. Tim had never been a jealous person, but now each of these moments felt like evidence, a piece of a puzzle he didn't want to put together. That night, lying next to Melissa, Tim couldn't sleep. Her steady breathing, usually soothing, now seemed like a mockery. He stared at the ceiling, his mind conjuring up scenarios, each worse than the last. What if she'd known all along? What if she'd deliberately hidden the truth? What if the children knew? That last thought was the most painful. He imagined looking into Sophie's eyes, her innocent face, and asking if she knew he wasn't her father. He couldn't bear it. The next day, Tim took action. Sophie was at school and Melissa was away with a client, so he had a few hours. He went up to Sophie's room, feeling like a thief in his own home. Her room was typical of a teenager. band posters on the walls, textbooks scattered on the desk, a mirror covered with photos of her friends. Tim took her hairbrush from the dresser, hoping there was some hair left on it, roots, enough for a DNA test. He carefully collected a few hairs in a plastic bag, trying not to think about how far he had fallen. When Nate came home Friday night, Tim was ready. He offered his son pizza and a basketball game, knowing Nate would love some pepperoni and a chance to talk sports. After dinner, Tim picked up the empty soda bottle Nate had been drinking and carefully placed it in a bag, making sure there were traces of spit on the neck. He felt like a detective in a pulp thriller, but his shame was drowned out by his desperation. Ellie was more difficult. Tim called her on Saturday morning and asked to meet for coffee in Georgetown. She accepted, as enthusiastically as ever, and they arranged to meet at a cafe on M Street. Ellie resembled Melissa's same blonde hair, same open laugh, and the resemblance that had once filled Tim with pride now cut him like a knife. He took a disposable coffee cup with him, which he had labeled in advance, and when Ellie went to the bathroom, he quickly swapped hers for his own, taking the one she had been drinking from. It was easier than he had expected, but the guilt was almost unbearable. The DNA test kits arrived 3 days later, and Tim sent the samples to the lab that night, using an anonymous email address and a pseudonym. He paid for expedited processing, knowing that every day of waiting would be torture. As he waited for the results, his anxiety grew like a weed, invading every corner of his life. He became absent-minded at work, uncharacteristically missing details in contracts. His co-workers noticed that he was becoming quieter, but no one dared ask what was wrong. At home, he avoided Melissa, making excuses to stay late at the office or retreat to his study under the pretext of work. When they did talk, he found himself studying her face, looking for signs of guilt, of lying, of anything that might give him a clue. But Melissa was the same as always, caring, witty, slightly annoyed by his distance, but not enough to cause a scene. It only increased his paranoia. If she was lying, she was doing it masterfully. Tim began to notice little things that had escaped him before, like the way Sophie sometimes frowned, just like the man he'd once met at Melissa's party, David, or how Nate, despite his love of sports, had never been as tall or broad-shouldered as Tim had been at his age. Ellie, with her blonde hair and blue eyes, was almost a carbon copy of Melissa, but now Tim wondered whose genes she'd inherited. These thoughts were like poison, slowly eating away at his love for his children, and he hated himself for it. Every night, he lay awake, running through the possible scenarios in his head. What would he do if the tests confirmed his worst fears? Would he divorce Melissa? Tell the kids? What if the tests showed something else, some medical anomaly that would explain everything? He clung to that hope, but it was as thin as a spider's web. He imagined opening the letter with the results, seeing the words, "Not the biological father," and his world crumbling completely. He imagined looking into Melissa's eyes and asking, why? He imagined her crying, making excuses, telling him it was a mistake, or worse, that she had never loved him the way he thought she did. But most of all, Tim was tormented by the thought of his children. They were his heart, his pride, his reason for living. Even if they were not his biologically, he had raised them, loved them, been there for them every step of the way. Could he continue to be their father knowing the truth? Could he look at them without seeing the shadow of another man? These questions tormented him like a splinter that could not be pulled out. A week passed, and the results still hadn't come back. Tim felt on edge, his nerves on edge. He began to notice Melissa looking at him with increasing concern, Sophie asking if he was okay when he forgot to answer her questions. He knew he couldn't hide his condition for much longer, but he wasn't ready for the truth, not yet. He wanted to believe that there was a chance that this was all a mistake, that his life hadn't been built on a lie. But the seeds of doubt had already sprouted, and their roots were tangling in his heart, giving him no peace. Tim sat in his office, the door firmly closed and the curtains drawn, cutting him off from the soft morning light that poured into the house on North Stewart Street. On the desk in front of him lay a nondescript white envelope, delivered by courier only an hour ago. His fingers hovered over it, as if the paper might burn him. The envelope was thin, almost weightless, but to Tim it felt like a boulder, ready to crush everything that was left of his world. Inside were the results of a DNA test he had ordered, hoping to either disprove Dr. Kessler's words or confirm them with brutal clarity. Now that he had the answer in his hands, he wasn't sure he wanted to know. It had been a week since he'd sent the samples Sophie's hair, Nate's saliva, Ellie's coffee traces to the lab. 7 days of sleepless nights, lying next to Melissa, listening to her steady breathing and fighting the urge to shake her and demand the truth. 7 days of looking at his children and trying not to see the ghosts of another man in their features. He was holding on as best he could, hiding his anxiety behind a mask of work fatigue, but it was becoming increasingly difficult. Melissa had already asked him twice if he was okay, her blue eyes searching his face for answers he wasn't ready to give. Sophie, always sensitive, had noticed his distance and had even tried to joke to lighten his mood, but her jokes had only served to intensify his pain. Tim took a deep breath, his fingers finally brushing the envelope. He tore it open, careful, as if he were afraid the contents might explode. Inside was a single sheet of paper, printed in tiny type with the lab's logo in the top corner. He scanned the text, his heart pounding so loudly it drowned out all the sounds of the house, the distant hum of the dishwasher, Sophie's muffled voice on the phone in her room. The words on the page were dry, clinical, but each one stabbed him like a shard of glass. The DNA results indicate that subject A. Timothy Miller is not the biological father of subjects B. Ellie Miller, C. Nate Miller, and D. Sophie Miller. The probability of a biological relationship is 0%. Tim read the line 3 times, hoping the letters would rearrange themselves into something different, but they remained unchanged. His throat tightened, his breathing became ragged. He had expected this, had braced himself for the worst, but the reality hit him like a hammer anyway. Ellie, Nate, Sophie, his children, his pride, his heart were not his. Not biologically his. He leaned back in his chair, his vision clouding over, an emptiness growing in his chest that he couldn't describe. But that wasn't the end of it. The next paragraph stopped him in his tracks. Additional analysis revealed that subjects B, C, and D share a common genetic link with subject A through close consanguinity. Genetic markers indicate the likelihood that the biological father of subjects B, C, and D is a close relative of subject A, with the probability of consanguinity being within the first or second degree. Tim felt the blood drain from his face. Close relatives. His mind raced to the only person who fit that description, his younger brother, Robert. Robert Miller, 45, married, owner of a small construction firm in Richmond, 2 hours from Arlington. Robert, who had always been Tim's shadow, less successful, less disciplined, but with that easy, almost carefree charm that somehow always attracted people, especially women. Tim remembered how they had been inseparable as children. The 2-year age gap hadn't stopped them from sharing everything: a room, toys, secrets. In the summer, they'd built huts together in the woods behind their parents' house, climbed trees, raced bikes, and fought on the baseball field if one of them didn't follow the rules. Tim was the older one, serious, a little stubborn, and always knew what was right. Robert was an improviser who could laugh in the middle of a fight or turn punishment into a game. And though they had become different over the years, Tim had gone off to college, married, got a job, while Robert had stayed closer to home, trying his hand at different endeavors. There remained an invisible bond between them, an almost brotherly loyalty that had something primal about it. When Tim had Ellie, Robert arrived with a bag of diapers and a bottle of cheap wine. When Robert's dog died, Tim sat with him in the backyard all night in silence. Robert was a frequent visitor to their home in the early years of their marriage. He'd come over for dinner, play with Ellie's baby, bring toys, and laugh with Melissa about her crazy stories from the startup where she worked 20-hour days. Tim would often smile at them. They were so different, but they seemed to connect effortlessly. It seemed sweet at the time. Now, everything seemed suspicious, bitter. Memories surfaced with a new coloring. He began to re-examine every moment, every smile, every glance through the prism of what he had just learned. And fear, cold and sticky, began to penetrate into the deepest corners of his consciousness. Tim closed his eyes, his mind filled with memories he'd long since buried. Robert laughing at dinner, his hand lingering a little too long on Melissa's shoulder as he told yet another story. Robert came over for the weekend with a bottle of whiskey and jokes that made Melissa smile a little wider than usual. Robert, who'd once, when Ellie was about 3, said something like, "She's all like her mom, but her eyes are pure Miller," and Tim had laughed it off, not thinking much of it. Now it sounded like a joke. He stood up, his movements jerky, almost convulsive. The envelope and the piece of paper remained on the table, but their contents were already seared into his soul. Robert, his own brother, the man he had protected as a child when their father had become drunk and violent, the man he had lent money to start his own business, the man he had considered family. The thought that Robert might have slept with Melissa, that he might have been Ellie, Nate, and Sophie's father, was like a knife in his back. Tim knew he couldn't rush to Melissa with accusations. Not now, not without evidence. His lawyer's mind, accustomed to sifting through complex cases and finding the weak points in his opponent's arguments, had taken over. If he was going to find out the truth, he had to be methodical, cool-headed, despite the storm of emotion that threatened to overwhelm him. He had to gather evidence, build a case, just like he had in the courtroom. Only this time, it wasn't a multi-million-dollar deal at stake. It was his family, his life. He started with what was at hand, his own memories. Tim pulled a notebook out of a drawer and began writing down everything he could remember about the years when his children were born. Ellie had come along in 2003, 2 years after he and Melissa had married. Robert had been at their house a lot then, helping renovate their first house in Arlington, an old bungalow they'd bought on the edge of their means. He remembered Melissa and Robert spending a lot of time together, discussing plans for a kitchen remodel, while Tim was at work. At the time, it hadn't seemed odd Robert was his brother, and Melissa was his wife. But now, the memories seemed tinged with betrayal. Nate was born in 2006 and Sophie in 2010. Robert was still in their lives, though less frequently, as his business began to take off. But there were times backyard barbecues, family Thanksgiving dinners when Robert was there, and his charm, his ease with Melissa, now seemed more than just friendliness to Tim. He wrote down dates, events, anything that might be significant. It was excruciating, but he forced himself to keep going, as if each line in his notebook brought him closer to the truth. The next step was to gather more tangible evidence. Tim knew he couldn't just call Robert and demand an explanation that would be too risky. If Robert was guilty, he might deny everything, or worse, warn Melissa. Instead, Tim decided to start with the digital trail. He opened his laptop and logged into an old family email account that he and Melissa had used in the early years of their marriage for mutual business booking vacations, corresponding with contractors. The password still worked, which surprised him. He began combing through the archive, looking for any mention of Robert. Most of the letters were mundane bills, appointment reminders, texts from friends. But then he came across a chain of emails from 2002 between Melissa and Robert. They were discussing a renovation, but the tone was too warm, too personal. "You always know how to make me laugh," Melissa wrote in one. "I don't know what I'd do without you." Tim felt his stomach clench. He copied the letters into a separate folder, his fingers shaking on the keyboard. Then he decided to check the old photo albums. In the basement, among boxes of Christmas decorations and old school projects from the kids, he found several of the albums Melissa loved to put together. He leafed through them, his eyes drawn to the pictures of Robert. In one, from Ellie's christening, Robert was standing next to Melissa, his arm around her waist, her smile too bright. In another, from Nate's birthday, Robert was holding the boy, and his eyes, Tim could see clearly now, were the same as Nate's dark brown, with long lashes. Tim knew that this evidence was not enough to bring a direct charge, but it fueled his suspicions. He decided that he had to meet Robert, not as a brother, but as a man seeking the truth. He called Robert under the pretext of discussing family matters. Their mother, who lived in a nursing home in Fredericksburg, had recently complained of ill health, and this was a convenient excuse. Robert agreed to meet in Richmond the following Saturday, suggesting that they have lunch at a small cafe where they had often been in the past. As Tim waited for this meeting, he continued to hide his emotions. At work, he was a model of professionalism, closing deals and running meetings, but his colleagues began to notice that he had become even more withdrawn. At home, he tried to be the old Tim, the father who asked Sophie how her school was going, the husband who listened to Melissa talk about her day. But every time he looked at her, he saw Robert's shadow, and it made him silent, distant. Melissa sensed it. One evening, as they sat in the living room, she put her hand on his shoulder and asked, "Tim, what's going on? You're not yourself." Her voice was soft, full of concern, but Tim couldn't bring himself to answer honestly. Instead, he mumbled something about stress at work and walked into his office, leaving her with a worried expression. Inside, Tim was on edge. He didn't know how to deal with the anger that was building inside him like a storm. Anger at Melissa for her possible lie. Anger at Robert for the betrayal he hadn't yet proven but already felt. And worst of all, anger at himself for not noticing, not suspecting, not protecting his family from this pain. He knew that the truth, whatever it was, would change everything. But he couldn't stop. The truth in the envelope had opened a door that couldn't be closed, and Tim walked down that path, collecting evidence that could either destroy his family or give him a chance to understand who he was now in this new, broken world. Tim sat in the corner of the daily grind in downtown Arlington, his fingers nervously fiddling with the rim of his coffee cup as he waited for his old friend, Dr. Mark Reynolds. The morning light poured through the wide windows, reflecting off the polished wood floors, but to Tim the world seemed drained of color, as if someone had turned off the sun. He had chosen this spot for a reason-neutral territory, away from home, where he could talk without Melissa or Sophie overhearing. Mark, a cardiologist with more than 2 decades of experience, was one of the few people Tim trusted enough to share his secret. They had been friends since law school, where Mark had been Tim's roommate, and their bond had stood the test of time despite their different careers and life paths. Tim had called Mark ahead of time, asking for a meeting but not going into details. He had said only that he needed a professional opinion on a medical matter, and Mark, with his usual directness, had agreed without asking unnecessary questions. Now, sitting in the cafe, Tim felt his resolve wavering. Telling Mark about the diagnosis, about the DNA tests, about the suspicions about Robert that would make it real, irreversible. But he couldn't keep it to himself any longer. He needed someone who could confirm or deny Kessler's words, who could give him at least a grain of hope that this was all a mistake. Mark walked into the cafe, his dark blue coat a striking figure against the morning bustle. He was tall, with close-cropped graying hair and tired eyes that betrayed years of night shifts at the hospital. He smiled when he saw Tim, but it quickly faded when he noticed the strained expression on his friend's face. "Tim, you look like you haven't slept in a week," Mark said, sitting down across from him and ordering an espresso from a passing waitress. "What's wrong? You said it was medical, but I can see it's more serious than high cholesterol." Tim tried to smile, but his lips only twitched. He pulled a folded sheet of paper from his briefcase, a copy of the DNA test results he'd received last week and Kessler's medical report. "I need you to look at this," he said, his voice low, almost husky, "and tell me if it's real." Mark took the papers, his eyebrows rising as he began to read. Tim watched him, catching every change in his expression, the slight narrowing of his eyes, the slight tightening of his lips. When Mark finished, he put the papers down and looked at Tim with a mixture of sympathy and professional reserve. "Tim, I'm not a geneticist, but Kessler's conclusion is compelling," Mark began, his voice cautious but firm. "Congenital bilateral absence of the vas deferens is a rare condition, but it's well studied. If the genetic panel confirms it, the chances of error are minimal. And the DNA results, they're unequivocal. You are not the biological father of these children." Tim felt his chest tighten, as if all the air had been squeezed out of him. He'd expected it, but Mark's words, spoken with such calm confidence, were like a second hammer blow. "What about this close relationship?" he asked, his voice shaking. They said the father was related to me. Could that be a mistake? Could the lab have messed something up? Mark shook his head. The labs that do these tests use cutting-edge technology. Mistakes happen, but they're rare, especially when it comes to close relatives. The genetic markers they analyze are very specific. If they say your father is a first or second-degree relative, that's probably true. Do you have brothers, cousins, anyone who could? He paused, watching Tim's expression darken. Robert, Tim said, his voice barely audible. My little brother, the only one who fits. Mark leaned back in his chair, his face growing serious. Tim, I don't know what to say. It's hard. Have you talked to Melissa about this? No, Tim said sharply, his fingers curling into fists. And I'm not going to until I'm sure. I can't just accuse her without proof. But I know Robert was there when the kids were born. He was at our house a lot. And now that I think about it, it all fits. Too many coincidences. Mark nodded, his eyes full of sympathy. I understand why you want to be careful. But Tim, this isn't something you can pick apart like a contract. This is your family. If you dig too deep, you might find things you don't want to know. I've already found things I don't want to know, Tim snapped, then softened. I'm sorry. I don't know how to live with this. I raised these kids, Mark. I was there when they took their first steps, when they were sick, when they cried. And now I find out they're not mine, and maybe my own brother. He didn't finish, his voice breaking. Mark reached out and squeezed his shoulder lightly. You're still their father, Tim. Biology isn't everything. But I understand why you need to know the truth. If you like, I can recommend a geneticist who can double-check the results. But be prepared for them to be confirmed. Tim nodded, but his mind was already elsewhere. He thanked Mark, paid for the coffee, and walked out of the cafe, feeling the cold October air sting his face. Mark's confirmation made it all more real, but it also pushed him to the next step. He had to talk to someone who knew his family better than anyone else. Someone who had probably kept this secret longer than he could have imagined. His mother, Alice Miller, lived in a nursing home in Fredericksburg, an hour outside of Arlington. She was 78, and despite her failing health, her mind was as sharp as a blade. Tim rarely visited her in his later years. Work and family took up all his time, but he always felt her presence in his life, like a shadow that never completely disappeared. Alice was a strict, unyielding woman who had raised two sons on her own after their father died of a heart attack when Tim was 16. She had always been proud of Tim, his successes, his family, but her relationship with Robert was more complicated. Robert was a rebel, a wayward son who often disappointed her, but she loved him anyway, perhaps even more than she loved Tim. Tim arrived in Fredericksburg on Saturday morning, telling Melissa he needed to visit his mother about her medical bills. It was a plausible lie. Alice often complained about mix-ups with her insurance, and Melissa didn't ask questions. When Tim walked into her room at the nursing home, he found her sitting by the window, a book in her lap. Her gray hair was neatly combed, and her eyes, as green as Tim's, studied him as he walked in. Timothy, she said, her voice firm despite her age. You rarely show up without a reason. What's wrong? Tim sat down across from her, his hands fiddling nervously with the strap of his bag. He didn't know how to begin, but his mother's directness left no room for evasion. Mom, I need to ask you something. It's personal, and I want you to be honest with me. Alice narrowed her eyes, her gaze sharp as a hawk's. I'm always honest, Tim. What do you want to know? He took a deep breath, his heart pounding. I went to the doctor. They said I was sterile. Since birth. That means Ellie, Nate, and Sophie can't be my children. But the DNA test showed that their father is a close relative of mine. I think it's Robert, and I want to know if you knew that. Alice's face didn't change, but her eyes flickered for a moment, and that was enough for Tim to feel his world crumble even further. She put the book down, her movements slow, deliberate. You've always been smart, Tim, she said at last, her voice calm but heavy. I knew you'd figure this out. Tim felt the blood run cold in his veins. You knew? You knew I was sterile. Alice nodded, her gaze steady, but with a hint of guilt. You had health problems when you were a teenager. Remember how sick you were in high school? We did tests, and the doctor told me about your condition. He said you wouldn't be able to have children. I didn't want to tell you then. You were young, ambitious, just starting out in life. I thought it would crush you. Tim stared at her, his mind trying to process her words. You knew all this time and didn't tell me? Why? Because you were my son, she replied, her voice sharpening. I wanted you to live your life to the fullest, to have the family you always wanted. When you met Melissa, I saw how much you loved her. I didn't want that truth to ruin your dreams. What did you do? Tim asked, his voice shaking with anger. You talked Melissa into sleeping with Robert? That was your plan. Alice looked away, her fingers tightening on the arms of her chair. It wasn't that simple, she said quietly. When Melissa found out she couldn't get pregnant with your child, she was devastated. You'd only been married a year, and she was afraid it would ruin your marriage. I talked to her. I told her there was a way to keep the family together. Robert was willing to help. He loved you, Tim, but he also loved Melissa. It wasn't about passion, it was about giving you what you wanted. Tim felt the ground shift beneath his feet. His mother, the woman who taught him honesty and responsibility, had orchestrated this lie. His brother, whom he had protected and supported, had become part of this secret. And Melissa, his wife, had agreed to it. He stood up, his hands shaking. You talked my wife into sleeping with my brother so I could live in a fantasy. Do you have any idea what you've done? I did what I thought was best for you, Alice replied, her voice firm but her eyes shining with tears. I wanted you to have a family, Tim. I knew how much you wanted children. It wasn't your decision to make, he shouted, his voice echoing off the walls of the room. You stole the truth from me. You made me live a lie for 25 years. Alice was silent, her face pale, but she didn't look away. I don't regret my choice, she said finally. I gave you a family. Ellie, Nate, Sophie, they're your children, Tim, regardless of biology. You're their father. Tim turned and walked out of the room without another word. He felt something tearing inside him, as if the floor had suddenly disappeared beneath him, and he was falling into darkness. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The world he lived in began to crumble like an old mirror, shattering into shards of memories and lies. His mother, Melissa, Robert, they had all been complicit in a carefully constructed spectacle, architects of the deception that had become the foundation of his life. He remembered Melissa going on retreats after Christmas in the early years of their marriage, trips she explained as a way to reset after stressful months, especially sleepless nights with a baby in her arms. He had believed then. He hadn't asked questions then. He had stayed with the baby, feeling like a good husband, a supporter. Now he was faced with the terrifying possibility that she might have been with Robert, his brother, his blood. Every memory now felt poisoned. Laughter at dinner, a tender look from Melissa on a holiday morning, a touch on the arm that he mistook for love. He was no longer sure that any of it was genuine. It all felt like puzzle pieces with key pieces missing, and maybe he'd been looking at them all along, but not wanting to see them. When he got back to the car, his hands were shaking so badly he could barely get the key into the ignition. The blood was pounding in his temples, and his face looked pale and alien in the rearview mirror. He was asking himself questions that had no easy answers. What should he do next? Confront Melissa now? Call Robert and demand an explanation? Or keep quiet for now and keep gathering evidence, checking, doubting, watching until he is absolutely sure? But he knew one thing for sure. The mystery he had only just begun to unravel was just the tip of the iceberg. There was a whole story beneath the surface, long, possibly sordid, and utterly destructive. And the truth he now yearned to know could destroy everything he thought his life was. His family, his love, his self. Tim stood in the shadows of his office, his fingers sliding over the smooth surface of the phone on his desk. Outside, Arlington was drowning in the gray gloom of late October, the rain pounding the windows in a rhythm that seemed to mock his inner chaos. The days since his conversation with his mother had been an endless swirl of anger, pain, and paranoia. Alice, his own mother, had admitted that she knew about his infertility and had talked Melissa into fixing the problem with Robert. The words, spoken with cold certainty, still burned like acid. But Alice's confession was just the beginning. Tim needed the truth from Melissa, and he wasn't going to wait for her to tell him. His lawyerly mind, accustomed to methodical steps and evidence gathering, told him he had to be careful. A direct confrontation with Melissa could lead to denial, tears, manipulation, anything he wasn't prepared to live through without hard facts. He'd already collected circumstantial evidence, old letters, photographs, his mother's words, but it wasn't enough. He needed an irrefutable blow that would shatter the wall of lies his wife hid behind, and he knew how to do it. Tim had spent the last 2 days researching surveillance techniques. He wasn't one to give in to impulses easily, but desperation had pushed him to make decisions that would have seemed unthinkable a month ago. He'd looked online for phone spyware apps that could record calls, intercept messages, and track locations. It was easier than he'd expected. A few clicks, a stealth installation, and he could know everything Melissa was doing. He'd chosen a highly rated app that promised complete privacy and stealth. It was called SpyGuard, and according to reviews, it was perfect for his purposes. That evening, while Melissa was taking a shower, Tim picked up her phone from the nightstand. He'd known her password Sophie's birthday for years, just as she knew his. It was one of those little things that had seemed like a symbol of trust in their marriage. Now that trust had been shattered, and using the password against her left Tim with a strange mix of guilt and determination. He quickly installed the app, following the on-screen instructions, and set it up to send data to his private, secure email address. Then he connected the location tracker, allowing him to see where Melissa was at any given moment. When he was done, he put the phone back, checking that the screen looked the same as before his intervention. When Melissa emerged from the bathroom, wrapped in a towel, her hair was damp, and she had a small smile on her face. "You went to bed early today," she remarked, sitting on the edge of the bed and applying cream to her hands. Her voice was warm, but Tim detected a note of wariness in it, as if she sensed his distance. "Yes, I am," he replied, looking down at the book he was holding but not reading. His heart was pounding, but he forced himself to remain calm. He was the hunter now, not the hunted, and that thought, though grim, gave him strength. The next day, the data started pouring in. Tim was checking his email in the office, hiding his laptop screen from any colleagues who might pass by his cubicle. Melissa's messages were mundane: emails with clients, dinner plans with a friend, a reminder to Sophie about a school project. But then, around midday, he saw a call notification. Melissa was calling Robert. Tim felt his stomach clench, but he connected to the recording the app had automatically saved. The sound of her voice, soft, enveloping, and painfully familiar, hit Tim like a slap in the face. "Hello, baby," she said. The word, baby, stabbed him like a knife, sharp and unexpected. He had never heard Melissa call him that, not even in their most intimate moments in 20 years of marriage. It was not a casual address. It belonged to another person, another world, one where he had no place. Her tone was light, almost playful, but there was an intimacy in that lightness, an intimacy that could not be faked. It sounded like a confession. Robert's voice came from the other end of the phone, low and slightly husky, with a lazy warmth that Tim had always known, but now heard differently. "Yeah, everything's fine. Just up to my ears at work. How are you? Is Tim okay?" The sound of his brother's name was like a punch to the gut. Tim froze, unable to move, his fingers gripping the edge of the table so tightly his knuckles turned white. These two were talking about him as if he were an outsider, as if he weren't their husband, their brother, the center of their lives. Melissa hesitated, the lightness in her voice gone, replaced by caution. "He's not quite okay. Something's bothering him, but he's not saying anything. You know how he closes up when he's feeling down." Tim felt the anger rising inside him like an avalanche thundering somewhere in his chest. Everything she said seemed right, but it sounded like she was discussing not her husband, but a nuisance, a burden. Maybe we should talk to him, Robert suggested. His voice was warm, as always, caring, sincere, or at least that's how it always seemed. But now, that concern sounded like hypocrisy, like a cynical gesture covering up something much deeper. I can come if needed. The sentence struck Tim even harder than before. He imagined Robert walking through the door of their home again, walking through the living room where they had once decorated the tree together, sitting down at the same table where Ellie had done her homework. No, don't, Melissa replied too quickly. It's all under control for now. I just miss our conversations, you know. Silence. A second, too. Yes, Robert said finally. Me too. Those two words, me too, carried everything. Memories Tim had never known, feelings that weren't his, a life someone was leading parallel to his own. Horror and clarity were boiling inside him at the same time. Everything he had suspected was taking shape. Not just guesses, not just disbelief. This was the truth no longer in your face, but in your bones. And he had to do something about it. Tim turned off the recording, unable to listen any longer. His hands were shaking, and a mixture of anger and pain was building in his chest. Baby. The word swirled around in his head like a poisonous thorn. It confirmed everything he had suspected, everything he had been afraid to admit. Melissa and Robert. Not just an old fling, not just a deal his mother had orchestrated for the sake of family. This was something more, something that had been going on for years, perhaps. He imagined them together, laughing, sharing secrets, building a life behind his back, and the image was unbearable. Tim closed his laptop and stared out the window of his office, where the Washington, D.C. skyline loomed cold and still. He had reached the point of no return. There was no longer room for doubt, for hope that this was all a mistake. His wife, his brother, his mother, they had all been complicit in a deception that had lasted for decades, and now he had to decide what to do next. His first impulse was to storm the house, throw the tape of her conversation with Robert in Melissa's face, and demand an explanation. He imagined her face, her tears, her attempts to justify herself, but that fantasy quickly gave way to another, cold, calculated revenge. Tim was not a man given to emotional outbursts. His career had taught him to control himself, to strategize, to strike only when he was sure of victory. And now he was determined that he would not give Melissa or Robert a chance to slip away. He would proceed methodically, as he did in a courtroom, gathering irrefutable evidence so that when the time came, they would be unable to deny the truth. He started with the tracker. That same evening, when Melissa said she was going to meet a client in Riston, Tim checked her location. The tracker showed that she wasn't at the client's office, but at a small cafe in downtown Richmond, 2 hours away from home. Richmond, the city where Robert lived. Tim felt his blood boil, but he forced himself to stay calm. He took a screenshot of the map showing her location and added it to the evidence folder he kept on the encrypted drive. The next few days were a strange dance. Tim played the role of loving husband and father, smiling at Sophie at breakfast, discussing Thanksgiving plans with Melissa, but all the while he was watching. Every text, every call, every move. He discovered that she texted Robert often, though the messages were careful, veiled, as if they knew someone might read them. "See you next week," Robert wrote. "If I can," Melissa replied. The little phrases were like shards of glass digging into Tim's heart, but he kept collecting them, adding them to his grim collection. He also began digging into the past. Tim remembered Melissa going on her retreats after Christmas in the early years of their marriage. Back then, he'd thought of them as harmless a way for her to cope with the stress of a new job and motherhood. Now he saw them in a new light. He found old credit reports in their family files and noticed charges for hotels in Richmond on the same dates Melissa was supposedly on retreats. It wasn't hard evidence, but it added another layer to his suspicions. Tim knew that what he was doing, the wiretapping, the surveillance, was morally questionable, perhaps even illegal. But he no longer cared about morality. His life had been built on lies, and he felt he had a right to know the whole truth, no matter how painful it might be. He began planning his next move, meeting Robert. He had already arranged for dinner in Richmond, but this was no longer just a family gathering. This was a chance to look his brother in the eye, to gauge his reaction, maybe even to provoke him into a confession. The night before the trip to Richmond, Tim sat in the living room, watching Melissa and Sophie laughing at something on Netflix. Their laughter, so familiar, so dear, tore him apart. He loved them, despite everything. Sophie, with her wit and her Broadway dreams, was his little girl, even if she wasn't biologically his. Melissa, despite her betrayal, was still the woman he loved more than anything in the world. But the love was now mixed with rage, and the mixture was toxic, destructive. As Melissa rose to make tea, she stopped next to Tim and touched his shoulder. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice soft but her eyes flickering with concern. "Yeah," he lied, forcing a smile. "Just thinking about tomorrow's trip." She nodded, but her gaze lingered on him a little longer than usual. Tim knew she could feel his distance, but he couldn't let it slip. Not now. He was on edge, but he had to hold on until he had all the answers. As Melissa went into the kitchen, Tim pulled out his phone and checked the last call he'd made to Robert. "I'm worried about him," she said, her voice shaking. "He's not the same. I'm afraid he knows something." "Calm down," Robert replied. "Tim doesn't know anything. He's too busy with his work. Just carry on as usual." Tim gripped the phone so tightly the screen almost cracked. Those words, that confidence they had in him that they could continue to deceive him, were the last straw. He was no longer a victim. He was a man who knew the truth and was ready to act. Tomorrow's meeting with Robert would be the beginning of the end of the lies, the end of the illusions, the end of the family he once considered his. Tim had reached the point of no return, and there was no turning back. The rain had stopped, leaving a damp sheen on the streets of Arlington, where streetlights reflected in puddles like broken mirrors. The miller's house on North Stewart Street was deceptively quiet, broken only by the clink of dishes and the muffled voices coming from the dining room. Tim stood at the living room window, his gaze fixed on the dark garden, but his mind was far from the neatly trimmed bushes and ivy-covered fence. Tonight, he was going to destroy everything he'd spent so long building, the illusion of a happy family, the fragile facade that concealed a lie. The dinner he'd organized wasn't just a family reunion. It was a scene he'd carefully orchestrated to expose the truth and make those responsible pay. The idea for dinner had been conceived after his last conversation with Melissa, when he'd heard her call Robert "baby" over the phone. That word, so intimate and betraying, had been the final nail in the coffin of his patience. He could no longer live in the shadow of their deception, pretending he knew nothing. But Tim was not one to act on impulse. His career as a lawyer had taught him that the most devastating blows were struck with a cool head, facts in hand, and a carefully thought-out plan. He decided to gather everyone, Melissa, Robert, and his wife, Glenda, at the same table, to look them in the eye before he confronted them with the truth. Tim had suggested dinner under the guise of a family reunion. Robert and Glenda lived in Richmond, but often came to Arlington on business, and Robert had happily agreed when Tim called. "It'll be like old times," Robert had said, his voice full of the same easy charm that had once made Tim trust him implicitly. Now it was a voice that Tim found repulsive. Glenda, a quiet, mild-mannered woman, was Robert's perfect match, or so it seemed. Tim wondered if she knew about her husband's affair with Melissa, but decided that was none of his business. Melissa and Robert were his targets tonight. The dining room was decorated with the impeccable elegance Melissa always brought to their home. White tablecloth, crystal glasses, silverware. It looked as if they were entertaining important clients rather than Tim's brother and wife. Melissa chose the menu: roast duck with cranberry sauce, mashed potatoes with truffle oil, and a goat cheese salad. She was in her element, moving around the kitchen with a grace that had once charmed Tim, but now only increased his pain. Sophie had been sent to a friend's house for the nighttime, did not want her to witness what was about to happen. When Robert and Glenda arrived, the house was filled with the sounds of greetings and laughter. Robert, dressed in a dark gray sweater and jeans, looked as usual. slightly disheveled but charming, with a warm smile that hid his true intentions. Glenda, in a simple blue dress, held a bottle of wine, a gift for the hosts. Melissa hugged them both, her smile as bright as ever, but Tim noticed a slight tension in her movements, as if she sensed that something was wrong. "Tim, old man, you look like you're ready to sign the deal of the century," Robert joked, clapping his brother on the shoulder as they sat down at the table. His eyes, as green as Tim's, but with a twinkle of mischief, met his brother's. Tim forced himself to smile, but his smile was cold as ice. "Maybe," he said, his voice even, but inside he was seething. He looked at Robert, at his easy posture, at the way he chatted easily with Melissa about trivialities, and imagined his throat tightening. But he kept his composure, knowing the moment would come. Dinner began quietly. Melissa served the first course, and the conversation swirled around mundane topics. Robert's business, Glenda's new job at a local gallery, the latest news from Washington. Tim was quieter than usual, nodding in the right places, but his gaze kept returning to Melissa and Robert. He noticed little things that had eluded him before, the way their eyes met a little too long, the way Melissa laughed at Robert's jokes with the same intimate warmth he'd heard in her voice on the phone. Glenda seemed oblivious, her attention focused on her food and the conversation, but Tim couldn't be sure. When the main course arrived, Tim decided it was time. He put down his fork, his movements slow, deliberate, like a man preparing to jump. He looked at Melissa, then at Robert, and his voice, when he spoke, was as hard as steel. "I have an announcement," he said, and all three of them turned to look at him. Melissa frowned slightly, her hand hovering over her wine glass. Robert raised his eyebrows, his smile still there, but with a hint of wariness. Glenda just watched, her face curious. Tim paused, letting the silence build tension. He pulled a folded sheet of paper from his inside jacket pocket, a copy of the DNA test results, and laid it on the table without unfolding it. "I know the truth," he continued, his gaze fixed on Melissa. "I know that Ellie, Nate, and Sophie are not my biological children, and I know who their father is." Melissa paled, her hand shaking, and the wine splashed lightly onto the tablecloth. Robert froze, his smile vanishing as if someone had wiped it off his face. Glenda looked at her husband, her eyes wide with confusion. "Tim, what are you talking about?" Melissa asked, her voice shaking but attempting to maintain control. "I'm talking about the 25 years you and Robert have been lying to me," Tim said, his voice rising but still holding himself together. "I know about your retreats, Melissa. I know about the calls you make, the way you call him baby. And I know he's the father of my children." Robert started to say something, but Tim held up his hand, silencing him. "I did a DNA test. It confirmed that the children are not mine, but their father is a close relative of mine. And the only person who fits that description is you, Robert." He turned to Glenda. "I'm sorry you have to hear this, but your husband slept with my wife. More than once. For years." Glenda gasped, her hand clasped to her chest, her gaze darting to Robert. "Is it true?" she whispered, her voice thick with pain. Robert opened his mouth, but the words caught in his throat. Melissa jumped up, her chair sliding back with a bang. "Tim, you don't understand. It's not what you think." Her voice broke, tears welled up in her eyes, but Tim felt no pity for her. "I'm filing for divorce, Melissa," he said, his words cold as a blade. "And I'm filing for child support against Robert. He's the kid's father, and he's going to pay for them. I'm not going to live this lie anymore." Robert jumped up, his face red with anger. "You can't just ruin everything, Tim. You don't know the whole story." "I know enough," Tim snapped, his fists clenching. "You slept with my wife. You stole my family from me. You think I'm just going to swallow that?" Robert stepped towards him, his eyes blazing. "It wasn't my idea. It was Mom. She talked us into it so you could have a family." The mention of Alice was like a spark in a powder keg. Tim lunged at Robert, his fist connecting with his brother's jaw so hard that he staggered back to his knees. Melissa screamed, and Glenda jumped up, trying to pull Tim away, but he was furious, his mind a blur of red. He punched Robert again in the cheekbone, and he collapsed, blood trickling from the corner of his mouth. "Tim, stop," Melissa screamed, clawing at his arm, but he pushed her away, his chest heaving. Robert tried to rise, but his movements were sluggish, dazed. Tim stood over him, his fists still clenched, but the rage was beginning to recede, leaving an emptiness in its wake. "Get out of my house," he said, his voice low and menacing. "And you, Melissa, I don't want to see you." Glenda, crying, helped Robert up, and they hurried out without looking back. Melissa stayed behind, her face wet with tears. "Tim, please let me explain," she begged, but he turned his back on her. "You've had 25 years to explain," he said without turning around. "It's too late now." As the door slammed behind Robert and Glenda, Tim slumped into a chair, his body shaking with adrenaline. The dining room, once so elegant, now looked like a battlefield. An overturned chair, wine stains on the tablecloth, a sheet of DNA results lying on the floor. Melissa stood in the doorway, her shoulders shaking with sobs, but Tim didn't look at her. He had reached a point where pain and anger merged into determination. He had lost his family, but he wasn't going to let them go without consequences. The dinner from hell was over, but the war was just beginning. The night after the dinner that had torn the Miller family apart left a silence as heavy as lead. The house on North Stewart Street, once so full of life and laughter, now felt foreign to Tim, as if he were a guest in his own life. Melissa had gone to live with her sister in Baltimore, taking nothing with her except a bag of clothes and a tear-stained face that Tim refused to see. Sophie was staying with a friend, and he didn't dare explain to her what had happened, yet the truth was too hard to bear on a 16-year-old girl. He sat in his office, surrounded by papers and empty coffee cups, trying to make sense of the chaos that had become his reality. But his thoughts kept returning to Glenda, a woman he barely knew, but who, like him, had been betrayed by a man she trusted. Glenda called the next day after dinner. Her voice on the phone was quiet, shaky, but there was a steely determination to it. "Tim, we need to talk," she said, wasting no time on formalities. "I don't know what to do, but I can't just sit here and say nothing." Tim agreed to meet, suggesting a cafe in Richmond where they could talk without being overheard by anyone they knew. He felt a strange kinship with Glenda. They were both victims of the same betrayal, their pain connecting them like a thread stretched to breaking point. When Tim arrived at the cafe, Glenda was already waiting for him at a corner table, her fingers fiddling nervously with the edge of her napkin. Her dark hair was pulled back into a tight bun, and her face, usually calm and composed, was pale, with dark circles under her eyes. She looked as if she hadn't slept, and Tim recognized in her fatigue a reflection of his own insomnia. He sat down across from her, ordered a black coffee, and waited silently for her to begin. "I didn't know," Glenda said, her voice low, almost a whisper. "I swear, Tim, I had no idea. Robert never told me anything that would indicate it." Her eyes filled with tears, but she quickly wiped them away, as if refusing to allow herself to weaken. "I thought we were happy. I thought he loved me." Tim nodded, his throat tight. He knew the feeling, the shock of having the world you thought was yours crumble in an instant. "I didn't know either," he said, his voice hoarse. 25 years, Glenda. I raised their children thinking they were mine. And now I find out my mother orchestrated it, that Melissa agreed, that Robert." He trailed off, unable to continue. Glenda looked at him, her eyes full of pain, but also a hint of anger. "Robert left," she said, her fingers gripping the napkin so tightly that it tore. "After what happened at your house, he came back to Richmond, packed up, and left. Said he needed time to sort things out. I don't even know where he is now." She smiled bitterly. He didn't even try to justify himself. He just ran away like a coward. Tim felt his own anger flare up again, but this time it was mixed with sympathy. Glenda didn't deserve this. She was an innocent victim, like him, caught up in the web of lies woven by his brother and wife. "I'm sorry you had to go through this," he said, and his words were sincere. "I didn't mean for you to find out so, publicly, but I couldn't keep quiet any longer." "I understand," she replied, her voice softening slightly. "You did what you had to do. I probably wouldn't have been able to keep it to myself either. But Tim, what now? What are we going to do?" The question hung in the air like a cloud of smoke. Tim didn't know the answer. He had filed for divorce and was already consulting with a lawyer about how to hold Robert accountable for child support. But these were legal steps, cold and mechanical. They couldn't fill the void in his soul, couldn't erase the pain of betrayal. He looked at Glenda, at her tight lips and hard eyes, and realized that she felt the same thing, a loneliness that ate away at him from the inside. They talked for more than an hour, sharing their pain, their memories of Robert and Melissa, their years of ignorance. Glenda told how she had met Robert 10 years earlier, how he had charmed her with his easy-going manner and promises of a stable life. She admitted that she had always felt he was hiding something, but had chalked it up to his restless nature. Tim, in turn, shared the story of his marriage, how he had trusted Melissa, how proud he had been of his family, until everything had fallen apart. By the end of the conversation, there was a strange sense of closeness between them, as if their shared pain had bound them together more tightly than years of acquaintance. As they left the cafe, the rain began to fall again, a fine, cold drizzle, and Glenda suggested they stop at a nearby bar for a stiff drink. Tim agreed without hesitation. He didn't want to go back to the empty house, where every room reminded him of Melissa. The bar was dark and cozy, with wood paneling and dim lighting. They sat at the bar, ordered whiskeys, and continued talking, but now the conversation was less heavy, more personal. Glenda talked about her love of painting, how she dreamed of being an artist, but had chosen a more stable career in a gallery. Tim shared stories about his children, how Ellie once put on a theater show in the living room, how Nate had tried to learn to play guitar, but gave up after 2 lessons, how Sophie always knew how to make him smile. These memories were bittersweet, but talking about them with Glenda was easier than he'd expected. After their third glass of whiskey, their conversation grew quieter, their gazes longer. Glenda touched his arm, her fingers warm despite the chill of the evening. "You don't deserve this, Tim," she said, her voice soft but strong. "You're a good man. I see you're struggling, but you're not alone." Tim looked at her, and in her eyes he saw not only sympathy, but something else, desire mixed with pain and anger. It echoed within him. He was alone, broken, angry at the world, and Glenda was a mirror of his emotions. He didn't think when he leaned in, his lips found hers, and she kissed him back with the same desperate passion that raged within him. They left the bar in a taxi without speaking, their hands entwined as if they were afraid to let go. Glenda suggested they go to her place. Her house in Richmond was empty, Robert gone, and she didn't want to be alone. Tim agreed, not giving himself time to think. He knew it was wrong, an impulse born of pain and revenge, but he didn't care. He wanted to feel something other than emptiness. Their night was a mixture of passion, pain, and anger. In Glenda's bedroom, with its white walls and the paintings she'd never finished, they gave each other a fury, as if they could exorcise their demons through touch. Tim felt her skin beneath his fingers, her breath on his neck, and for a moment he could forget about Melissa, about Robert, about the lies that had ruined his life. Glenda, in turn, clung to him, her nails digging into his back, as if she were trying to keep herself from falling into an abyss. When it was over, they lay in the dark, their breathing heavy, their bodies still shaking with tension. Neither of them spoke, but the silence spoke louder than words. They both knew this wasn't love, this wasn't the beginning of something new. This was revenge not just on Robert and Melissa, but on the world that had betrayed them. Glenda turned to him, her eyes glittering in the dim light. "It doesn't change anything, does it?" she whispered. "No," Tim replied, his voice empty, "but it was necessary." They parted in the morning without promises, without plans for the future. Tim returned to Arlington, his mind clearer, but his heart still aching. He knew that the night with Glenda hadn't healed him, but it had given him a strange sense of power. He was no longer just a victim. He had made a choice, however wrong, and it had reminded him that he could still act. Now, with renewed determination, he was ready to continue his fight not just for the truth, but to rebuild his life on his own terms. The morning light was filtering through the thick clouds, casting a pale, almost ghostly glow over Richmond. Tim sat in a small coffee shop on Carey Street, his fingers wrapped around a mug of black coffee that had long since gone cold. Glenda sat across from him, her dark hair pulled back into a loose ponytail, her eyes still glazed with fatigue as she studied him. It had been a week since their night together, a night steeped in anger and despair, and now they were meeting again to sort out what was left of their lives. Their conversations had become regular, not out of a desire to continue what had happened, but out of a need to share a burden that neither of them could bear alone. They were like two travelers lost at the same crossroads, where every road led to the unknown. Glenda sipped her latte, her fingers fiddling with the edge of her napkin. "I filed for divorce," she said, her voice calm but firm, as if she'd finally made a decision she'd been putting off. "The lawyer says it'll be easy. We don't have kids, we don't have any property together except the house, and we can sell that." Robert doesn't even try to argue. He just disappeared. Tim nodded, his eyes glued to his coffee mug. He knew Robert had left Richmond. The tracker he still had on his brother's phone showed him staying somewhere in North Carolina. It was typical of Robert, running when the pressure got too much. "I've started the process too," Tim said, his voice even, but inside he could feel his heart clenching. "Melissa isn't resisting, but she wants to negotiate. She's still calling, texting, trying to explain. I'm not answering." Glenda looked at him, her eyes full of sympathy. "Do you think she'll tell the truth? The whole truth, without excuses?" Tim smiled bitterly. "I don't know if she's capable of this. She says it was all for me, for the family, but it sounds like a lie to ease her conscience. I don't want to listen to her. Not now." He paused, his fingers tightening around his mug. "But I can't keep this from the kids any longer. They need to know." Glenda frowned, her hand hovering over the table. "Are you sure? They're young, Tim. This could break them." "They're not that young," he countered, his voice firmer. "Ellie's 22, Nate's 19, Sophie's 16. They deserve the truth. I can't keep pretending everything's okay when their world is about to fall apart. They need to know who their real father is, even if it breaks their hearts." Glenda nodded, but her eyes were full of doubt. "Just be careful. They love you. You're their father, no matter what the DNA says. Don't push them away by trying to be honest." Her words stung Tim, but he knew she was right. His children, Ellie, Nate, Sophie, were the center of his world, even after he learned they weren't biologically his. The thought of telling them the truth filled him with dread, but he couldn't live with a lie that had already destroyed his marriage and his faith in family. He decided to write them letters, one for each, to explain everything as he understood it. The letters would be honest but not cruel, and he hoped they would understand his pain and his choices. Back home in Arlington, Tim locked himself in his office, where the evidence of his investigation still lay: printouts of old letters, photographs, DNA results. He pulled out 3 sheets of paper and began to write, his hand shaking but forcing himself to continue. Each letter began the same way: "My dear Ellie, my dear Nate, my dear Sophie." He wrote of his love for them, of the years they had spent together, of how they had made his life complete. Then he moved on to the truth, the diagnosis that had turned his world upside down, the DNA results, Melissa and Robert's betrayal, his mother's role in the lie. He spared no detail, but he tried to soften it, emphasizing that his love for them would never change. "I am not your biological father," he wrote in each letter, "but I have always been and always will be your dad. You are my heart, my pride, my reason to live. I don't know how you will accept this truth, but I hope you can forgive me for not telling you this sooner." When Tim was finished, he sealed the letters and mailed them. To Ellie at her apartment in Georgetown, to Nate at his dorm in Charlottesville, to Sophie in her room, where she would find him when she got home. He couldn't bring himself to deliver them in person. The fear of their reactions was too great. He knew it was cowardly, but he also knew he couldn't bear to see them cry or be angry at that moment. The replies started coming in a few days later. Ellie wrote first. Her letter was short but full of emotion, written in her neat handwriting. "Dad, I don't know what to say," it began. "I cried when I read your letter, but not because you're not my biological father. I cried because I can't imagine what you've been through. You've always been my dad, and that will never change. I'm angry at Mom, at Uncle Robert, at Grandma, but not at you. I love you." Tim read her words a dozen times, his eyes blurred with tears, but they were tears of relief. Ellie, his strong, smart Ellie, was still with him. Nate called instead of texting, which was typical. His voice was shaking, but he tried to keep it together. "Dad, I don't know how to process this," he said. "I don't want to think of Uncle Robert as my dad. You're the one who taught me how to ride a bike, who came to my games. You're my dad. I want you to be okay." Tim listened, his throat tight with emotion, and promised Nate they'd get together soon to talk. Sophie was the hardest. She found the letter when she got home and locked herself in her room. Tim could hear her sobbing through the door, but she didn't open it when he knocked. It wasn't until late that night that she emerged, her face swollen from crying, and threw herself into his arms. "Why did they do this to you?" she whispered, her voice full of pain. "You're the best dad in the world. I don't want you to go." Tim hugged her, his heart breaking, but her words were like balm on his wounds. The children's responses gave Tim something he hadn't expected, a sense that he was still needed, that his love for them had not been in vain. But they also strengthened his resolve to move on. He met Glenda again, this time at her home in Richmond, where they drank wine and talked about the future. Glenda admitted that the divorce was liberating, but it left her feeling empty. "I don't know who I'll be without Robert," she said, her voice quiet. "But I know I don't want to be the one who lets him ruin my life." Tim nodded, feeling her words echo in his soul. "I don't know who I'll be either," he admitted, "but I know I can't go back. Melissa, Robert, my mother, they made their choices. Now it's my turn." They sat in silence, their eyes meeting, but this time there was none of the desperate passion that had brought them together the last time. Instead, there was an understanding, fragile but real. They were at a crossroads, and though their paths might have diverged, they held each other now, like two people who had survived the same shipwreck. Tim returned to Arlington with a new clarity. His children loved him, and that was all that mattered. His divorce from Melissa was in full swing, and he was prepared to fight for child support from Robert. But most of all, he wanted to find a way to build a new life, not for revenge, but for himself and the people who still called him Dad. They were all at a crossroads, but Tim knew his path was up to him now. A cold November wind blew fallen leaves through the streets of Fredericksburg as Tim and Glenda pulled up to the nursing home where Alice Miller lived. The sky was heavy with gray clouds, and the air smelled damp, promising rain. Tim sat behind the wheel of his Audi, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. Beside him, Glenda was silent, her gaze fixed out the window, but her taut posture held the same determination as Tim's. They had arranged to visit Alice a few days ago, after another conversation in Richmond, when it had become clear that without a full understanding of her role in this deception, neither of them could move on. Alice was the key to the mystery, the shadow that hung over their shattered lives, and today they were going to demand the truth from her. Tim had not been to the nursing home since their last conversation, when Alice had revealed that she knew he was infertile and had talked Melissa into having children with Robert. He had left then, unable to bear her calm justification for her betrayal. But now, after the letters from his children, after their words of love and support, he felt he had to go back not just for himself, but for Glenda, whose life had been as shattered as his. Glenda, for her part, wanted to understand how the woman she had thought of as a kind and caring mother-in-law could weave such a complex web of lies. They entered the building to the smell of hand sanitizer and the faint scent of flowers from a vase in the hall. The receptionist recognized Tim and led them to Alice's room. The old woman sat in her chair by the window, her thin arms resting on the armrests, her eyes, sharp and green like Tim's, watching them as they entered. There was no surprise on her face, only a slight weariness, as if she had been expecting this visit. "Timothy," she said, her voice firm despite her age, "and Glenda didn't expect you two together." She tilted her head slightly, her gaze sliding over Glenda, a hint of curiosity in her eyes. "Why did you come?" Tim sat across from him, his back straight as a string. Glenda settled in next to him, her hands folded in her lap, but her fingers fiddling nervously with the hem of her sweater. "We're here to find out the truth, Mom," Tim said, his voice low but steely with determination. "The whole truth, without your excuses. I know you talked Melissa into using Robert so I could have kids, but I want to know how far it went, and why." Alice sighed, her gaze drifting to the window where the clouds were gathering, promising a storm. "I told you, Tim," she began, her voice calm but weary. "I did it for you. You always wanted a family, and I couldn't let your infertility ruin your dreams." "That doesn't give you the right to play with my life," Tim snapped, his voice sharpening. "You didn't just talk Melissa into it. You planned it. You chose Robert. Why? Why him?" Alice looked at him, her eyes narrowing. "Because he was the only one who could," she said. "Robert was your brother. His children would be close to you by blood, almost like yours. I knew he'd say yes because he'd always envied you, Tim. Your career, your marriage, your life. This was a way to give him something he never had and keep your family together." Glenda gasped, her hand tightening on the arm of her chair. "You exploited his jealousy?" she asked, her voice shaking with anger. "You manipulated my husband into betraying his brother? Do you have any idea what you've done?" Alice turned to Glenda, her gaze cool but not hostile. "I didn't know you then, Glenda. I was only thinking about Timothy, about his happiness. Robert was a tool. He agreed because he wanted to feel important, wanted to be part of something bigger. I didn't force him. He made a choice." Tim felt his blood boil. "Choice?" he repeated, his voice thick with sarcasm. "You pushed him into this. You pushed Melissa. You spun this lie, and now my family is ruined. My life is ruined. Do you even realize what you've done?" Alice was silent, her lips pressed into a thin line. For the first time, Tim saw something like guilt in her eyes, but she quickly hid it, sitting up straighter in her chair. "I gave you children, Tim," she said, her voice quieter but no less firm. "Ellie, Nate, Sophie, they're yours, no matter what science says. I gave you the family you wanted." "You gave me an illusion," Tim snapped, "and you knew it was a lie. Did you know Robert and Melissa continued their relationship after that?" Alice hesitated, her gaze flickering for a moment, and that was enough for Tim to realize she knew more than she was letting on. "I suspected," she finally admitted. "Melissa and Robert were close. I saw the way they looked at each other when they thought no one was looking. But I didn't interfere. It was their business." Glenda jumped up, her face purple with anger. "Their business?" she screamed. "You ruined my life. You ruined Tim's life. You think it's just their business. They lied to both of us for years, and you just turned a blind eye." Alice looked at Glenda, her face unreadable. "I did what I thought was right," she said. "I don't regret my choice, but I'm sorry you had to suffer, Glenda." Tim stood, his fists clenched. "Your regrets are worthless," he said, his voice cold as steel. "You didn't just engineer my children. You allowed it to continue. You allowed Melissa and Robert to build their secret lives behind my back. You covered for them." Alice was silent, her eyes shining, but she did not cry. Tim turned to Glenda. "Come on," he said, his voice firm. "We found out all we need to know." They walked out of the room without looking back, leaving Alice in her chair, a lonely figure surrounded by the shadows of her own decisions. In the car, Glenda began to cry, her shoulders shaking but not making a sound. Tim put his hand on her shoulder, his own pain reflected in her tears. They didn't speak until they were out of Fredericksburg, but the silence between them was full of understanding. When Tim got home, he received a text from Melissa. She asked to meet him to explain everything. He agreed, not out of a desire to forgive, but because he wanted to hear the truth from her lips. They met at a small cafe in Arlington, where the lights were dim and the tables were spaced far apart, providing privacy. Melissa looked haggard, her blonde hair pulled back into a messy bun, and there were dark circles under her eyes. She tried to smile, but it quickly faded when she saw the expression on Tim's face. "Tim, I don't know where to begin," she said, her voice shaking. "I know you hate me, and I don't blame you, but I want you to understand why this happened." "Then talk," Tim said, his voice cold, but he forced himself to listen. "And no lies. I know about Robert. I know he's the children's father. I know my mother arranged this, but I want to know why you kept doing this. Why didn't you stop?" Melissa looked down, her fingers fiddling with the edge of her napkin. "It all started with Alice," she admitted. "When we found out you couldn't have children, I was devastated. I loved you, Tim, and I knew how much you wanted a family. Alice offered a solution, Robert. She said it would be almost like your children, because he was your brother. I agreed because I didn't want to lose you." "But you didn't stop there," Tim said, his voice thick with pain. "You kept at it. For years, I heard you call him baby. I saw your texts, your trips to Richmond. It wasn't just a deal, Melissa." She began to cry, her shoulders shaking. "I didn't mean for it to go this far," she whispered. "But Robert, he was there when I felt alone. You were so busy with work, always in the office, always in your deals. And he listened to me, understood. It was wrong, I know, but I couldn't stop." Tim felt his anger flare up again, but he forced himself to remain calm. "You lied to me for 25 years, he said. "You looked me in the eye, slept with me, raised children with me, and all that time you were with him. How could you?" "I loved you," she said, her voice breaking. "I still love you, but I was weak. I made a choice, and it was wrong. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I want you to know that I never meant to hurt you." Tim looked at her, at the woman he loved more than anything in the world, and saw only a stranger's face. "You destroyed our family," he said, his voice quiet but firm, "and I don't know if I can ever forgive you." He stood up and walked away, leaving Melissa at the table, her tears falling onto a napkin. Outside, the rain had finally started, cold drops hitting his face, but he didn't feel them. He was empty, but there was clarity in that emptiness. The truth he had sought was complete, and now he had to decide how to live his life. Alice, Melissa, Robert, they were all part of the shadow that hung over his life, but he was ready to step out of it, even if it meant going it alone. Night had blanketed Fredericksburg in a thick blanket of darkness, with only the dim light of street lamps penetrating the November fog. Tim drove the familiar road to the nursing home where his mother, Alice, lived with one goal in mind: to finally come to terms with the past. His heart pounded with a mixture of anger and determination, his fingers gripped the steering wheel tightly, and his mind raced with the words he was about to say. After his last conversation with Alice, when she had confessed to her part in the deception with Melissa and Robert, Tim felt he could no longer maintain a connection with a woman who had so coldly manipulated his life. He decided to spend the night in her guest room, so that in the morning, with a fresh mind, he could put the finishing touches on their relationship. But fate, as always, had other plans. Tim parked his car outside the nursing home and walked into the building, unaware of the cold wind biting at his skin. He was greeted at the front desk by a familiar employee who, recognizing him, nodded silently toward Alice's room. Tim knocked, but there was no answer. He pushed the door open, expecting to find his mother asleep, but instead his gaze fell on a scene that seared away the last of his composure. Melissa and Robert, half naked, in his mother's bed, their bodies entwined in an intimate embrace. The light from the bedside lamp cast harsh shadows on their faces, frozen in shock as they spotted Tim. Time froze. Melissa gasped, pulling the covers up to her chin, her eyes wide with horror. Robert jumped up, his face purple, but before he could say anything, Tim had stepped forward, his fists clenched, ready to strike. Instead, he froze, his gaze moving to Alice, sitting in a chair in the corner of the room, her face as impenetrable as a stone mask. She was awake, not surprised, she knew. The thought struck Tim like lightning. "You knew," he growled at his mother, his voice shaking with rage. "You knew they were here together, and you did nothing." Alice looked up slowly, her green eyes, so like his, cool and calm. "It's none of my business, Timothy," she said, her voice level, as if she were discussing the weather. "I can't control their choices." Melissa tried to speak, her voice full of tears. "Tim, please, it's not what you think." "Don't you dare," he snapped, his voice like a whip. "You slept with my brother in my mother's house, in the same room I slept in as a child. Do you think I'll believe a word you say?" He turned to Robert, who was struggling with his shirt, his movements awkward with panic. "And you betrayed me not once, but my entire life." Robert raised his hands in surrender. "Tim, I didn't mean for this to happen. It was a mistake." "A mistake?" Tim took a step toward him, his voice rising. "You slept with my wife, fathered my children, lied to me for decades. That's not a mistake. That's betrayal." He turned to Alice, his chest heaving. "And you planned this whole thing. You didn't just know, you made it happen. You stole my family from me." Alice rose from her chair, her movement slow but sure. "I gave you a family, Timothy," she said, her voice firm but with a hint of weariness. "You would never have known if it hadn't been for your doctor. I protected you." "Protected?" Tim nearly screamed, his voice echoing off the walls. "You lied to me, manipulated me, made me live in an illusion. You're not a mother, you're the architect of my pain." He took a step back, his eyes burning. "This is the end. I don't want to see you again, ever." Alice froze, her face finally breaking, but she said nothing. Melissa burst into tears, trying to stand, but Tim had already turned toward the door. "You're getting divorce papers," he called over his shoulder. "And you, Robert, get ready for court. I won't stop until you pay for everything." He walked out, slamming the door, and the cold night air hit him in the face like a slap. His heart was pounding, but there was a strange clarity in his chest. The last drop of patience had been exhausted, and he felt free, though broken. He got into his car and drove to Richmond, to Glenda, the only person who could understand his pain. Glenda met him at the door of her house, her face pale but her eyes determined. She already knew Robert had called her after Tim had caught him with Melissa and confessed everything. "I'm done with him," she said, her voice quiet but firm as they sat in her living room with glasses of whiskey. "I filed for divorce, and he didn't even try to stop me. He left, saying he needed time, but I don't care. I can't be part of his lies anymore." Tim nodded, his fingers tightening around his glass. "I just walked in on them together," he said, his voice hoarse. "In my mother's room. She knew Glenda. She knew all along, and she was covering for them." Glenda gasped, her hand flying to her lips. "Oh, Tim, I'm so sorry." She moved closer, her warm hand coming to rest on his. "You don't deserve this. No one does." They sat in silence, sharing the pain that had bonded them more deeply than they could have expected. Glenda told him how she'd found Robert's old letters to Melissa, hidden in his office love notes dating back to the years when his marriage to Tim still seemed solid. It was the final confirmation that Robert had never ended his relationship with Melissa, even after the children were born. Glenda decided to sell the house in Richmond and start a new life, perhaps in another state. "I don't know where I'm going," she admitted, "but I know I can't stay here, where everything reminds me of him." Tim understood her decision. He felt like the house in Arlington had become a cage for him, full of memories of lies. He told Glenda about the letters he'd written to his children, and their replies about how Ellie and Nate and Sophie had assured him of their love. It had been the one bright spot in his life, and he clung to it like a lifeline. "I don't know how I'm going to live my life," he admitted, "but I know I can't go back to Melissa, and I can't call Alice my mother anymore." Glenda squeezed his hand. "You're not alone," she said, her voice soft but strong. "We've both lost everything, but we're still here. We'll find a way to move on." That night, they didn't cross a line like they had the other time. Their connection was deeper than a passing passion. It was a camaraderie born of shared pain. Tim returned to Arlington at dawn, empty but with a new resolve. He had severed ties with his mother for good, and the break, though painful, was necessary. Glenda, for her part, had closed the chapter of her life with Robert once, and for all, filing for divorce with no look back. Tim knew he had a long road ahead of him: courts, child support, trying to build a new life for himself and his children. But the last bit of truth he saw that night made it clear. He would no longer be a victim. He would fight for himself, for Ellie, Nate, and Sophie, for the future they could still build together. Winter arrived in Arlington with a bitter cold, blanketing the town in a thin layer of frost that sparkled in the morning sun like the fragile promise of a new beginning. Tim stood at his office window, looking out over the empty garden where his children had once played, but where now everything seemed as frozen as his own life. The past few months had been a whirlwind of pain, anger, and revelation. The divorce from Melissa, the breakup with his mother, Robert's betrayal. But the letters from Ellie, Nate, and Sophie, full of love and support, had been an anchor, keeping him from falling completely over the edge. Now that the truth was out, Tim felt he had to find a way not just to survive, but to move on for himself and for those who still called him father. His thoughts kept returning to the diagnosis that had turned his world upside down: congenital bilateral absence of the vas deferens. The condition, Dr. Kessler had explained to him, was incurable in the sense that natural conception was impossible. But medical technology offered hope. After extensive consultations with doctors who specialized in men's health and heredity, Tim learned of a modern medical procedure that could restore his ability to father children. The method was complex but reliable, using minimally invasive technology to obtain the necessary cells, which were then used in assisted reproductive programs. It was a complex and expensive process, but for Tim, it symbolized the possibility of rewriting his destiny, of taking back control over what had been taken from him. The decision was not an easy one. Tim spent weeks weighing the pros and cons, discussing the details with Mark, a cardiologist friend who supported him every step of the way. "This won't change the past," Mark warned, "but it can give you the future you choose." Tim was hooked, and he signed up for the surgery. The procedure took place at one of Washington's top hospitals under the guidance of an experienced surgeon. It was a success. When he left the clinic, his body aching but his soul energized, he felt like he was breathing freely for the first time in months. There was new blood in his veins, not just physical, but metaphorical, a sign that he could start over. To get back into shape after the surgery, Tim joined a gym in downtown Arlington, a modern complex with floor-to-ceiling windows where the smell of chlorine from the pool mingled with the rhythmic music blaring from the speakers. He was no stranger to working out, but in recent years his physical activity had been limited to morning jogs, and the stress of his divorce had left his body tense and his muscles weak. The gym became a refuge, a place where he could release his anger and pain and replace them with strength and clarity. It was there, on a gray December evening, that he met Hilda. She was standing at the barbell rack, her movements confident but graceful, as if she were dancing with the weights. Her dark hair was pulled back into a high ponytail, and her lightly tanned skin glistened with sweat. She was in her mid-40s, with sharp features and dark honey eyes that radiated a mixture of determination and warmth. Tim didn't notice her right away. He was deep in thought, doing another set of bench presses, but when she asked him to spot her, their eyes met, and he felt a spark he hadn't expected. "Do you mind?" she asked, her voice low, with a slight huskiness that made it sound alive. "I need help with this weight." Tim nodded, wiping the sweat from his face with a towel. "Sure," he replied, standing up and walking over to the bar. They exchanged a few words about technique, about keeping his back straight, and soon the conversation descended into light chit-chat. Hilda was an architect, working for a small firm in Washington, D.C., specializing in green projects. Her passion for her work was infectious, and Tim, himself accustomed to the intense pace of a legal career, found it comforting. After the workout, they lingered at the water bar, talking. Hilda told him she'd recently gone through a divorce. Her engineer husband had left her for a colleague, leaving her with a sense of betrayal that Tim understood all too well. "I thought I knew him," she said, her eyes darkening. But it turned out I was living with a stranger. What about you? What brought you here, other than to lift weights? Tim hesitated, unused to sharing his story with strangers. But there was something about Hilda that invited him to open up. Maybe it was her direct gaze, or the small smile that didn't hide the pain but didn't give in to it either. He told her the short version: the divorce, Melissa and Robert's betrayal, his mother who had spun the lies. He didn't mention his children, feeling that part of his heart was still too fragile to share. Hilda listened without interrupting, her face sympathetic but not pitiful. "This is hell," she said when he finished. "But you're here in the gym instead of drowning yourself in whiskey. That shows you're stronger than you think." Her words stung him, and he smiled, genuinely for the first time in a long time. They exchanged numbers, agreeing to meet again, not at the gym, but for coffee. It wasn't a date, not exactly, but there was something in the air Tim couldn't ignore, a spark that promised more than just friendly conversation. Their next meeting was a few days later at a cozy cafe in Georgetown, where the smell of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the cinnamon aroma of baked goods. Hilda wore a dark green coat, her hair down, framing her face in soft waves. She looked less like a woman who had just gone through a divorce and more like someone who had decided to take charge of her life. They talked for hours, jumping from work to personal dreams. Hilda told him about her desire to build a home completely off the grid, where she could live in harmony with nature. Tim shared stories about his children and how their love had helped him through his darkest days. Their connection grew quickly but naturally, as if they were two puzzle pieces that had finally found each other. A week later, they met again, this time at a restaurant overlooking the Potomac, where the candlelight reflected in her eyes, making them even warmer. After dinner, they walked along the riverfront, their hands occasionally brushing, each moment like an electric shock. When Hilda stopped to look at the river, Tim leaned in and kissed her. It wasn't a fit of anger or revenge, as with Glenda, but something genuine, born of a desire to feel alive. Their first night together was in her apartment in Washington, a small but cozy space filled with architectural sketches and design books. The passion between them was fierce, but it lacked the desperate anger that had accompanied his night with Glenda. It was like coming back to life, like breathing in after being underwater for so long. Hilda was gentle but strong, her touch sure, and her laughter, as they lay in the dark, was music. "I didn't think I could feel this way again," she whispered, her fingers entwined with his. "And you?" "Me too," Tim admitted, his voice soft. "I thought my heart was dead. But you make me want to live." Their bond became an anchor for both of them. They spent more and more time together, working out at the gym, dining out at small restaurants, walking through snowy parks. Hilda was unlike Melissa. She was direct, open, with a strong character that didn't hide her vulnerability. She respected his space, didn't push him when he talked about children, and shared her plans for the future, which inspired him to think about his own. Tim told her about his operation, how he could now become a father if he wanted. Hilda listened intently, her eyes shining with curiosity. "Is that what you want?" she asked one day as they lay in her bed, staring at the ceiling. "Another child, your blood?" Tim thought for a moment, his hand on her waist. "I don't know," he admitted. "I love Ellie and Nate and Sophie more than anything. They're mine, even if they're not blood. But the idea that I could create something of my own, something real, it excites me." Hilda smiled, her fingers brushing his cheek. "You'll do it when you're ready," she said, "and whoever that woman is, she'll be happy with you." Their relationship wasn't perfect, they both bore scars from the past, and sometimes the shadows of Melissa or Hilda's ex-husband would loom over their conversations. But they were learning to trust each other, to build something new on the ruins of the old. For Tim, Hilda had become more than just a woman, but a symbol that life could go on, even after betrayal. His new blood, not just physical, but emotional, was now flowing for a future he could choose for himself. Spring had bloomed with unexpected generosity in Arlington, strewing the streets with cherry blossoms that swirled in the air like pink snow. Tim stood on the deck of his new home, a modest but cozy suburban cottage he had bought after selling the mansion on North Stewart Street. The past year had been a stormy ride for him. Divorce, betrayal, the breakup with his mother, but now, in the warm April sun, he felt his soul beginning to thaw. Hilda, standing next to him, placed her hand on her barely noticeable belly, her eyes shining with joy mingled with a hint of worry. She was pregnant, and the news, announced only a month ago, was a ray of light in the darkness that had surrounded him for so long. Their romance developed quickly but naturally, like a river flowing to the sea. After months of dating, talking until midnight, and working out together at the gym, Tim and Hilda became inseparable. She brought the warmth and honesty he needed into his life, and he, in turn, gave her stability and support, helping her through the pain of her divorce. When Hilda told him she was pregnant, her voice shook with emotion. "I didn't plan it so soon," she confessed, standing in his kitchen, her hands nervously fiddling with the hem of her sweater. "But I'm happy, Tim. Are you?" Tim looked at her dark hair falling over her shoulders, at her eyes full of hope, and felt his heart, so long constricted by pain, open. "I'm more than happy," he said, pulling her close. "I want this, with you." In that moment, he knew he was ready for a new beginning, for a family he would build on his own terms. The proposal came a week later, not with pomp, but with quiet sincerity. They were walking along the Potomac River, where their first kiss had ignited the spark, and Tim paused at the railing, pulling from his pocket a simple ring with a small emerald, a stone that reminded him of her strength and depth. "Hilda, you gave me hope when I thought all was lost," he said, his voice soft but firm. "I want to spend the rest of my life with you. Marry me." She cried, but her tears were happy, and she nodded, throwing herself into his arms. Their wedding was a small affair, a ceremony in a small garden outside the city, with a few close friends and Tim's children, Ellie, Nate, and Sophie. The children welcomed Hilda warmly, especially Sophie, who saw her not as a replacement mother, but as a new friend. Ellie, always practical, hugged Tim after the ceremony and whispered, "You deserve to be happy, Dad." Nate, less talkative, simply squeezed his hand, but his eyes said it all. For Tim, their presence was confirmation that, despite the truth about their biology, he was still their father. Hilda's pregnancy had gone smoothly, and by late autumn Thomas had come into their lives, a small, boisterous boy with Hilda's dark eyes and Tim's stubborn chin. When Tim had first held his son in the maternity ward, his heart had clenched with an emotion he had never felt before. This was his son, his blood, born of love, not lies. He looked at Thomas, his tiny fingers clutching his thumb, and he felt that everything he had been through, the pain, the betrayal, the anger, had led him to this moment. He was a real father, and no one could take that away from him. Tim threw himself into his new life with an enthusiasm he hadn't expected. Raising Thomas became his priority. He changed diapers, got up at night to rock him, and watched with delight as he smiled for the first time. Hilda, despite the fatigue of motherhood, was there, her laughter and energy filling the house with warmth. They made plans together, designing the eco-friendly house in the countryside that Hilda dreamed of, and discussing how Thomas would grow up surrounded by nature. Tim found new meaning in fatherhood, a sense that he was creating something real, something genuine. His relationships with Ellie, Nate, and Sophie remained warm, despite the distance and the pain of the past. Ellie, now living in New York and working for a marketing firm, came over on weekends, bringing books for Thomas and stories about her life. Nate, a student at the University of Charlottesville, called weekly, sharing his progress in school and his plans for the future. Sophie, still living in Arlington, often slept over at Tim and Hilda's, playing with Thomas and helping Hilda with the cooking. Their love for Tim remained strong, and he, in turn, tried to be not just a father to them, but a friend who understood their pain and supported their choices. While Tim and Hilda were building their new lives, Melissa and Robert were reaping the consequences of their actions. After that fateful night at Alice's house, when Tim caught them together, their lives began to fall apart. Melissa tried to contact her children, begging them to forgive her, but Ellie, Nate, and Sophie were adamant. They could not forget how their mother had lied to their father, how she had continued her relationship with Robert behind his back. Ellie, the eldest, wrote Melissa a letter in which she made it clear, you made your choice, and it did not include us." Nate stopped answering her calls, and Sophie, the most emotional, cried at night but refused to see her mother, saying that she could not trust her. Robert, for his part, lost not only his family but his reputation. His Richmond construction firm began to lose clients as word of his actions spread among his business associates. Glenda, after finalizing the divorce, sold their home and moved to Portland, where she began a new life working in a contemporary art gallery. She occasionally corresponded with Tim, and their friendship remained warm, but without a hint of romance. They both knew their connection was born of pain, not love. Robert tried to contact her, but she blocked his number, deciding that he was no longer entitled to her time. Melissa and Robert remained together, but their relationship was a shadow of what they had once hidden. They moved to a small town in North Carolina, away from prying eyes, but their lives were far from happy. Melissa lost her consulting firm, clients left when her personal scandals became known. Robert tried to start a new business, but his reputation as a traitor followed him like a shadow. They lived in a modest apartment, their days filled with recriminations and regrets. Tim's children refused to communicate with them, and even Alice, their last ally, turned against them when Melissa accused her of ruining their lives. The news of Alice's death came unexpectedly on a cold January day, a year after Thomas was born. Tim learned it from a care home worker who called to tell him that his mother had died of a heart attack. He stood in the living room, holding the phone, and felt a strange emptiness, not grief, not relief, but something in between. Alice was the architect of the lies that had destroyed his life, but she was also his mother, the woman who had raised him with firmness and love. He decided to go to the funeral, not for reconciliation, but to close the chapter forever. The funeral was held in a small church in Fredericksburg, attended by distant relatives and a few of Alice's old friends. Melissa and Robert did not appear. Tim had heard that they had avoided all contact with the family since the move. He stood by the casket, looking at his mother's face, now calm and still, and felt nothing but weariness. The past she had created was dead, and he had no intention of resurrecting it. He placed a white rose on the casket, but said no parting words. It was his last farewell to the woman who had given him life, but taken away the truth. Returning home, Tim embraced Hilda and Thomas, feeling their warmth as a reminder that his life now belonged to them. Ellie, Nate, and Sophie came for the weekend, and their laughter, mixed with Thomas's babble, filled the house with joy. The past was dead. Melissa, Robert, Alice, they all remained in the shadows that Tim had left behind. His life continued, full of love, hope, and a new life that he now proudly carried within him. He was a true father, and that was all that mattered. Friends, thank you for being with us. Subscribe if you are interested in such stories. There are a lot of exciting things ahead. We are trying for you, and any support is a huge motivation to continue. If something can be improved, write in the comments with kindness. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think, click to the next one.